Can someone escort the assistant out? This room is for engineers. The words would cost Blake Morrison more than his reputation before the day was over. But standing beneath the glow of a 40-foot presentation screen inside Titan Core Technologies headquarters, he had no idea. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be based on appearances, make sure to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us why dignity still matters. Now, back to Emily Carter. The 26th floor of Titan Core overlooked downtown San Francisco through walls of glass that reflected the morning sun. Inside the Executive Conference Center, tension hung in the air. Reporters filled a media room downstairs. Investors from New York, Chicago, and Seattle were connected through a live video feed. Millions of dollars had been poured into a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform that was scheduled to launch in less than an hour. Engineers in tailored jackets moved between rows of workstations while executives checked their watches every few minutes. In the middle of all that urgency stood Emily Carter, almost invisible. At 36, she wore a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, comfortable slacks, and practical shoes. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, and a visitor badge hung from a plain lanyard around her neck. She had arrived before sunrise to help replace a malfunctioning presentation system. Most people assumed she was technical support. A few assumed she was administrative staff. Nobody asked. Nobody cared. That was how it had been all morning. Emily quietly carried equipment, connected cables, and stayed out of the way while some of the brightest minds in the tech industry prepared to unveil what they believed would change the future. Then the disaster happened. 1 second, giant screens displayed polished demonstrations and performance metrics. The next, every display turned red. Error messages cascaded across the monitors. Live dashboards froze. Internal alerts erupted across the network. A silence swept through the room before being replaced by a storm of voices. Engineers rushed toward their terminals. Executives demanded answers. Investors began sending messages. Every passing minute threatened to erase confidence in a project worth billions. Emily looked toward the nearest monitor. Her eyes narrowed. She said nothing. Across the room, Blake Morrison, Titan Core's celebrated chief technology officer, stepped forward. At 42, he carried himself like a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. His navy suit was flawless. His confidence was legendary. And his patience was gone. As teams scrambled around him, Emily took one small step closer to a screen displaying system logs. She studied several lines of code flashing by. Then she quietly spoke. I think the issue might be deeper than the server cluster. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Blake turned toward her. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Blake laughed, and the room followed. The laughter spread quickly across the conference center. Not loud enough to sound cruel, but sharp enough to make its point. Blake Morrison folded his arms and looked at Emily as though she had wandered into a conversation far above her level. Deeper than the server cluster? He repeated. Thank you, but I think we will let the engineers handle engineering. Several executives chuckled. A few people glanced away awkwardly. Emily remained still. Her expression did not change. She simply looked back at the monitor where thousands of lines of system activity continued scrolling across the screen. Around her, panic intensified. Teams moved from workstation to workstation trying different fixes. One engineer suggested a network rollback. Another blamed the cloud infrastructure provider. A third insisted a cybersecurity attack was underway. Every theory sounded convincing for about 30 seconds before collapsing under the weight of new evidence. The launch clock displayed on the wall continued counting down. 52 minutes remained. In another room downstairs, reporters were already waiting for demonstrations that now seemed impossible. Investors began requesting emergency updates. The pressure inside Titan Core grew heavier. With every passing minute, Blake stepped into the center of the room and took command. Everyone focus, he said. We have some of the best engineers in the country working on this. We are not going to be distracted by random guesses. His eyes briefly returned to Emily. The message was clear. You do not belong here. Emily lowered her gaze and quietly moved toward the side of the room. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked what she had seen in the logs. Nobody asked why she had spoken at all. To them, she was simply support staff. An assistant. Someone who plugged in cables and fixed projectors. Yet as she walked past another workstation, something caught her attention. A small window displayed a sequence of error signatures repeating at nearly identical intervals. Her pace slowed. The pattern felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar. 12 years earlier, long before Titan Core became a technology giant, a young software architect had helped design an experimental adaptive framework that never received public recognition. Most of the original team had moved on. Some had retired. Others had become executives. But fragments of that architecture still existed deep inside Titan Core systems. Emily knew because she had been there. Not that anyone in this room knew it. Not anymore. She stopped near an unattended terminal and watched the diagnostics update in real time. The same sequence appeared again and again. Her heart beat slightly faster. Not from fear, from recognition. Nearby, a young engineer named Daniel Reeves noticed her staring at the screen. Unlike most people in the room, Daniel had not laughed earlier. He glanced at the monitor and then at Emily. "Do you see something?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated. Years of experience had taught her what happened when people made assumptions about appearances. Still, she answered honestly. "I think everyone is looking in the wrong place." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily looked at the stream of data. "If I am right, the failure started long before the servers crashed." Before Daniel could respond, another alarm flashed across the main display. The room fell silent for a second. Then the situation became even worse. A collective gasp swept across the conference center as the primary development environment suddenly locked itself out. Monitors flashed warning messages. Backup systems that were supposed to activate automatically remained unresponsive. The countdown clock on the wall now showed 41 minutes until launch. For the first time that morning, genuine concern appeared on Blake Morrison's face. He strode across the room toward the lead engineering team. "Tell me this is contained," he demanded. No one answered immediately. Fingers flew across keyboards. Senior developers exchanged nervous looks. One finally swallowed and spoke. "It is spreading across dependent systems." The room grew quieter. Even the executives stopped talking. Every person there understood what that meant. This was no ordinary outage. Something buried deep inside the platform was triggering failures faster than the team could isolate them. Daniel Reeves looked back toward Emily. She was still standing beside the unattended terminal, watching the diagnostic stream with unusual focus. Most people saw lines of data. Emily saw a story she recognized. Another sequence appeared, then another. The same timing, the same pattern, the same cascading behavior. 12 years disappeared in an instant. She remembered a small office with aging computers, late nights fueled by coffee, and a team of ambitious developers building a framework they believed could revolutionize adaptive machine learning. Back then the project had a different name, a different company, a different future. Emily had designed a recovery pathway intended to help the system learn from unexpected conflicts. It had been elegant, efficient, safe. At least it had been before years of modifications by engineers who never understood the original architecture. Her eyes narrowed. Someone had altered the adaptive layer. Not recently. Years ago. A tiny change. Almost invisible. Under normal conditions, it never surfaced. But under the massive load of a global launch event, the flaw had awakened. Daniel stepped closer. "You know what this is, do not you?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated. Across the room, Blake was issuing orders, demanding reports, assigning blame. Nobody was listening to support staff. Nobody wanted another opinion from the woman they had laughed at. "I think I know where it started," Emily finally said. Daniel stared at her. "Then why are you standing here?" Before she could answer, a senior engineer suddenly shouted from the front row. "We found it." Heads turned instantly. Relief spread across the room. Blake hurried over. "Talk to me." The engineer pointed at a graph on his screen. Memory corruption inside the adaptive processing layer. Blake smiled for the first time in nearly an hour. "Good. Fix it." The engineer's confidence vanished. "We cannot." Silence followed. "What do you mean you cannot?" Blake asked. "Nobody on the current team understands the legacy architecture well enough. The documentation is incomplete." The room seemed to shrink. Executives exchanged worried glances. Investors continued calling. Reporters waited downstairs. 40 minutes remained. Daniel slowly turned toward Emily. For several seconds, he studied her face. Then he asked the question nobody else had thought to ask all morning. How do you know so much about a system that predates most of us? Emily looked toward the giant screen where the failures continued multiplying. Her expression remained calm. Because I helped build it. Daniel stared at Emily as though he had misheard her. Around them, alarms continued flashing across monitors while engineers raced between stations, but for a moment his attention locked entirely on the quiet woman standing beside the terminal. You helped build it? He asked. Emily gave a small nod. A long time ago. Before Daniel could say another word, Blake Morrison noticed the conversation. Frustration already burned across his face from the worsening crisis. He walked toward them with quick, impatient steps. What is going on over here? He demanded. Daniel hesitated. She says she worked on the original architecture. Several nearby engineers looked up instantly. Blake blinked once before letting out a short laugh. Worked on it. His tone carried the same disbelief that had filled the room earlier. The original team consisted of elite software architects. Emily remained calm. I know. Blake folded his arms. And somehow nobody here has ever heard your name. The comment drew a few uncomfortable smiles from people standing nearby. Emily did not react. Years earlier, she might have tried to defend herself. She might have explained the acquisitions, the reorganizations, the projects that changed names 3 times before becoming the platform everyone now depended on. But experience had taught her something valuable. People determined to underestimate you rarely change their minds because of explanations. They change because of evidence. Across the room, another engineer suddenly called out. We just lost another recovery node. The tension returned instantly. Blake turned away from Emily and hurried toward the main operations table. Keep working, he ordered. We are running out of time. 34 minutes remained until launch. The giant countdown clock seemed louder now. Every second felt heavier than the last. Investors continued requesting updates. The executive team gathered near the glass wall overlooking the city, their expressions growing more concerned with every report. Meanwhile, Emily quietly stepped closer to the diagnostics display. The deeper logs had finally loaded. Thousands of entries filled the screen. Most people would have needed hours to analyze them. Emily needed less than a minute. There it was, hidden beneath years of revisions and patches. A single adaptive rule interacting with a deprecated optimization layer. Neither component was dangerous on its own. Together, they created a recursive conflict that multiplied under heavy demand. It was elegant in a strange way, almost beautiful, and incredibly destructive to performance. Daniel watched her expression change. You found it, did not you? Emily nodded slowly. I think so. Can you fix it? For the first time all morning, uncertainty crossed her face. Not because the solution was impossible, because she knew what would happen next. Nobody in that room wanted advice from support staff. Nobody wanted to admit they had ignored the person with the answer. Yet the countdown clock kept moving. 32 minutes. 31. Finally, Daniel took a breath and made a decision. He walked directly toward the center of the conference room where Blake Morrison was addressing executives. Blake, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I think Emily knows what is causing the failure. The room went silent. Dozens of heads turned toward the woman in the gray cardigan. And for the first time that day, every eye in the room was on her. The silence felt different this time. Earlier it had been filled with amusement. Now it carried uncertainty. Engineers who had ignored Emily minutes before were suddenly studying her face, searching for answers. Blake Morrison looked less amused than before, but pride still lingered in his expression. He glanced from Daniel to Emily and back again. All right, he said. Let us hear it. Emily stepped forward slowly. The massive display behind her continued flashing warnings as system failures spread across the platform. 30 minutes remained until launch. She looked at the screen, not at Blake. Everyone is trying to repair the damage, she said calmly. The problem is that the damage is not the cause. Several engineers exchanged looks. Blake folded his arms again. Then what is the cause? Emily pointed toward a section of diagnostics displayed on one of the monitors. A conflict between the adaptive recovery layer and a legacy optimization rule. The room remained quiet. She continued. The conflict has existed for years. Under normal traffic conditions, it stays dormant. Today, the launch event created enough demand to trigger recursive behavior inside the architecture. One senior developer frowned. That is impossible. We tested the recovery layer. Emily nodded. You tested the modern version. The problem is buried inside code that predates the current framework. Another engineer quickly opened additional logs. Within seconds, his expression changed. Wait. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. She might be right. More people gathered around his workstation. One by one, their expressions shifted from skepticism to concern. The deeper they looked, the more evidence appeared. Emily stood quietly while the room slowly caught up to what she had already seen. Blake was no longer smiling. Even if that is true, he said, we still need a solution. Emily hesitated for a moment. The hesitation did not come from uncertainty. It came from memory. 12 years earlier, she had written a safeguard specifically for situations like this. A hidden recovery pathway designed to isolate conflicting behaviors before they could spread. The safeguard had never been fully documented because leadership had rushed the project into production before development was complete. Most people assumed the unfinished work had been abandoned. It had not. There is a recovery mechanism, Emily said. Every head turned toward her again. Where? Blake asked immediately. Emily looked toward the diagnostics display. Inside the original architecture, the room went silent once more. One engineer laughed nervously. Nobody even knows where that code is anymore. Emily did not answer. Instead, she walked toward an empty workstation near the center of the room. Her calm movement seemed almost unreal compared to the panic surrounding her. Daniel watched closely. So did everyone else. Blake remained frozen for several seconds before speaking. You are telling me there is a solution hidden inside a system that nobody here understands. Emily finally met his eyes. I am telling you there was a reason I built it that way. For the first time all morning, Blake Morrison had no response. Around the room, executives stopped checking their phones. Engineers stopped arguing. Even the countdown clock seemed less important than the woman standing beside the keyboard. 29 minutes remained until launch. And suddenly the entire future of Titan Core seemed to rest in the hands of the one person nobody had taken seriously. No one tried to stop her as she sat down at the workstation. That alone was remarkable. Less than an hour earlier, most people in the room had barely noticed she existed. Now executives, engineers, and department heads watched in complete silence. 27 minutes remained until launch. The glow of multiple monitors reflected across Emily's face as she navigated through layers of architecture that many believed had disappeared years ago. Her hands moved calmly across the keyboard. Not fast, not dramatic, just precise. The room expected some kind of miracle. Instead, they witnessed preparation. Emily opened archived modules that nobody had touched in over a decade. She followed pathways buried beneath generations of updates and redesigns. Every few seconds, another engineer leaned closer to the screen. Every few seconds, another expression changed from doubt to astonishment. How does she know where all of this is? One developer whispered. Nobody answered. Daniel already knew the truth. The others were only beginning to understand it. Blake Morrison stood several feet away with his arms crossed. He was still trying to maintain authority, but uncertainty had begun replacing confidence. For years, he had been the person everyone turned to for answers. Today, he was watching someone else navigate a system he could not fully understand. Emily opened a hidden configuration layer. Several senior engineers immediately exchanged confused looks. That section is not in the documentation, one of them said. Emily nodded. It was never supposed to be public. More silence followed. She continued working. One screen displayed adaptive recovery protocols. Another showed dependency chains stretching across thousands of components. Deep inside the architecture, she located the safeguard she remembered. It was still there, untouched, waiting. The problem was exactly what she had feared. Years of modifications had created a conflict loop that kept forcing the system to fight against itself. Every attempted recovery triggered additional failures. The platform was not collapsing because it was weak. It was collapsing because it was obeying contradictory instructions. Emily studied the behavior for several seconds. Then she quietly said, I found it. The words instantly pulled every eye toward her monitor. Engineers gathered around the workstation. Executives moved closer. Even Blake stepped forward. On the screen sat a section of logic none of them had ever seen before. Daniel stared at it. That is the safeguard? Emily nodded. The original emergency pathway. One senior architect looked stunned. You built this. Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen. Finally, she said, I built it because I knew someone would eventually change the architecture without understanding every consequence. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody questioned her credentials. The room had moved beyond skepticism. They were witnessing something else entirely. Respect. 25 minutes remained until launch. Emily reached for the keyboard again. Her fingers paused above the keys. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. One command would activate the dormant recovery pathway. One decision would determine whether Titan Core survived the most important day in its history. And as dozens of industry experts watched in complete silence, the woman they had dismissed all morning prepared to do what none of them could. Emily pressed the key. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no celebration, no flashing success message, just a small change buried inside millions of lines of activity. For several seconds, the room remained perfectly still. Then one of the monitoring dashboards updated. An engineer leaned forward. Wait. Another screen refreshed. A second engineer straightened in his chair. Look at the recovery metrics. Across the conference center, graphs that had been plunging all morning began slowing their descent. Error rates dropped. Processing queues stabilized. One by one, warning indicators shifted from red to yellow. Nobody spoke. The room was too busy watching. Emily continued working. The safeguard had activated, but the system was still carrying years of accumulated conflicts. She moved through the architecture with the confidence of someone walking through a house she had built herself. Every command had purpose. Every adjustment connected to something deeper. Daniel watched in amazement. He had spent years studying distributed systems, yet he felt like a student observing a master class. She is not guessing, he whispered. She knows exactly where everything is. The realization spread quickly. Engineers who had once viewed Emily as an outsider now followed her every movement. Several began taking notes. Others opened, supporting diagnostics to verify what they were seeing. Each result confirmed the same impossible truth. The quiet woman in the gray cardigan understood the platform better than the people who currently ran it. 22 minutes remained until launch. Blake Morrison stood silently behind the group. Earlier that morning, he had controlled every conversation in the room. Now he barely spoke. The confidence that once filled his voice had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Reflection. Emily opened another layer of system controls and examined a cluster of dependent services. There, she said softly. That is where the conflict is spreading. A senior architect immediately checked the data. His eyes widened. She is right again. More engineers moved closer. The circle around Emily grew larger. Nobody was looking at titles anymore. Nobody cared who sat in executive offices or who carried visitor badges. Results had become the only thing that mattered. Emily entered a final sequence of adjustments and waited. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. Then the largest dashboard in the room refreshed. The effect was immediate. Error rates collapsed. Recovery performance surged. Processing capacity returned across the network. A wave of activity rippled through the monitoring systems as service after service came back online. The room erupted. Engineers jumped from their seats. Executives stared at the screens in disbelief. Someone actually applauded before realizing nobody else had started yet. Daniel looked at the countdown clock. 20 minutes remained. More importantly, the platform was alive. Fully alive. A senior engineer checked the validation reports twice before speaking. Core systems restored. Another voice followed. Machine learning services restored. Then another. Launch environment stable. One by one, the confirmations echoed across the room. Emily leaned back slightly and finally removed her hands from the keyboard. She looked almost relieved. Not proud. Not triumphant. Simply relieved. Around her, dozens of people stared at the screens that moments ago had seemed beyond saving. And standing among them, Blake Morrison slowly realized that the woman he had dismissed as support staff had just solved the problem that defeated every expert in the building. For several seconds after the final confirmation appeared, nobody moved. The conference center that had been filled with panic all morning now stood frozen in disbelief. Green status indicators stretched across the giant displays. Service stability remained above target levels. The launch platform was operating normally. The crisis was over. Yet the real shock had only begun. An executive near the back of the room slowly removed his glasses and stared at Emily. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Emily looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. She had spent years avoiding rooms like this, years avoiding recognition. Before she could answer, an older board member named Charles Whitaker stepped closer. At 70, Charles had been involved with Titan Core since its earliest days. He had remained mostly silent throughout the crisis, watching events unfold from the edge of the room. Now his eyes remained fixed on Emily. A look of recognition slowly crossed his face. Wait. The room turned toward him. Charles took another step forward. Emily Carter? Emily nodded politely. The color drained from his face. It cannot be. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Charles looked toward Blake Morrison. You do not know who she is? Blake remained silent. Charles laughed once, though there was no humor in it. The adaptive recovery architecture. The emergency failover framework. The self-correcting dependency model. He pointed toward the screens around them. She designed all of it. The room fell silent again. Every engineer stared at Emily. Charles continued. When Titan Core acquired Nexus Dynamics 12 years ago, her work became the foundation for everything this company built afterward. A senior executive frowned. I thought that architecture came from the acquisition team. Charles shook his head. No, it came from her. The realization spread through the room like a wave. Engineers who had spent years working inside the system suddenly understood why she had navigated it so effortlessly. She had not learned the architecture. She had created it. Blake Morrison looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. His eyes moved from Emily to the screens she had saved and back again. For the first time that day, he seemed completely at a loss for words. Daniel stood nearby, watching the reaction unfold. Earlier that morning, people had dismissed Emily because of a visitor badge and a gray cardigan. Now some of the most respected technology leaders in the country were staring at her as though they had just discovered a living legend. Charles smiled faintly. You disappeared after the acquisition. Emily nodded. I wanted a quieter life. You could have been running companies. Emily glanced around the room. I never cared much about titles. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned her. 20 minutes earlier, that statement would have sounded impossible. Now it sounded completely believable. Across the conference center, the launch team prepared to restart the global presentation. Investors received updated reports. Reporters downstairs were informed that the event would proceed as scheduled. Titan Core had been saved. Yet the most important lesson in the room had nothing to do with technology. It was written across the faces of every person who had overlooked the quiet woman standing beside the keyboard. The launch proceeded exactly 23 minutes later. Reporters filled the presentation hall. Investors joined from around the world. On giant screens, the platform performed flawlessly. Features that had nearly disappeared beneath the morning's chaos now worked exactly as intended. Applause echoed through the building as the demonstration concluded successfully. Executives shook hands. Board members smiled with visible relief. Billions of dollars in value had been protected. Yet the most memorable moment of the day happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Employees slowly returned to the conference center where the crisis had unfolded. The giant displays now glowed with healthy system metrics. The panic was gone. Only reflection remained. Emily quietly gathered her belongings. The same gray cardigan. The same visitor badge. Nothing about her appearance had changed. But the way people looked at her had changed completely. Engineers who had ignored her that morning now approached one by one. Some thanked her. Others asked questions about the architecture. A few simply offered a respectful handshake. Daniel Reeves smiled as he watched the transformation. Not of Emily. Of everyone else. Then Blake Morrison stepped forward. The room grew quiet. Earlier that day, he had dismissed her in front of everyone. He had laughed when she tried to help. Now dozens of people watched to see what he would do. Blake stood silently for a moment before speaking. I owe you an apology. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I judged you before I knew anything about you, he continued. And I was wrong. The words were simple, but they were genuine. Emily studied him for a second and then gave a small nod. Thank you. That was all. No lecture. No humiliation. No attempt to make him feel smaller. Blake seemed almost surprised by her response. After everything that happened today, that is all you have to say? Emily smiled faintly. The system is working. That was the important part. A few people laughed softly. Not at anyone. Just from relief. Charles Whitaker shook his head with admiration. You have not changed at all. Emily looked around the room. Most people spend their lives trying to prove how much they know. she said quietly. I learned a long time ago that it is more useful to keep learning. The room fell silent one last time. Not because of shock, because everyone understood the lesson. Earlier that morning, titles had seemed important. Expensive suits had seemed important. Job descriptions had seemed important. But when the Real challenge arrived, none of those things solved the problem. Character did. Knowledge did. Humility did. Emily picked up her bag and headed toward the elevator. No grand speech followed her. No celebration demanded her attention. As the doors opened, Daniel called out one final question. Will we see you again? Emily smiled. Maybe. Then she stepped inside. The elevator doors closed. And that day, inside one of the most powerful technology companies in America, a room full of experts learned something they would never forget. The smartest person in the building had been the one they almost failed to notice. And the true measure of wisdom was never how loudly someone spoke. It was how much they understood before they did.